Yeah.
Yeah, so they get help. So we have 77. Oh, yeah, which we are used to. And we have time, so nice to show up. I definitely think that. Very well. I think it's nice for like my team is really like more she's not. Yeah, just she's on the team. Yeah, I'm really excited for the freshmen too. Yeah, I know our students. Yeah, it feels like it's kind of like not turn it actually. When is your media day? It's on Wednesday. Okay. And it's kind of bittersweet. No, I know. No more spending money. Well. Yeah, no more spending. Way too much money. No, it's yeah, because I remember an education. I was working in the store. Just
Okay, give a quick second for people who might still be coming in and then we'll get going. All right. Good afternoon. Let's get going. Got some people who are back from travel and for some things. Sounds like things went well. For those of you who have gone and coming back, so welcome. Glad to have you here. So we're moving right along, and this is actually week number 8 out of 10. So this is actually our. We only have 5 more class meetings after today, so we're really getting pretty close to the end. We are meeting today and Wednesday, but then after this week, we have the whole next week off for Thanksgiving break. So you probably got some emails about campus being open for the first couple days next week. That's generally the facilities. So this class is not going to be held next week. So you might just double check about your other classes that might be meeting. You have other face-to-face classes, but we're not going to be meeting next week. And then when we come back from Thanksgiving break, we are going to be having 2 weeks left 1 week where we'll be talking about future directions of communication and social change. And then our final week where we will be seeing the presentations and hearing from ORA. So I just got an update earlier this afternoon. It's not in the slides yet, but I've heard back from Oregon Rural Action and also heard from your feedback in that survey about final presentations. Just as a reminder, ORA wanted to meet with us during our one of our final 2 class meetings in December because that's what worked in their schedule. The time that ORA would like to meet with us is going to be Wednesday, December 7th. So that is our final class meeting of the term. I think will be a really cool way to cap things off. So what I'll be doing then is there are a number of folks who are traveling and are not going to be able to be here for the final week of class anyway. So people who are not going to be able to come to class for the final week will have an option to present what they're doing remotely. We'll be able to talk more about what that might look like. But given the length of the class and the number of presentations we will be able to present on that date, we'll have the other presentations on the 5th. So basically, we have this week of classes, week after Thanksgiving break. Both of those will play as normal. And then for the final week, we'll use December 5th for people who are able to present face-to-face on that date. And then the 7th for ORA to share what they do. And then our final Canvas prompt of the term will be connected to that ORA presentation. So if you're not able to attend, there'll be an option for that to be recorded or viewed later. And I think that'll be a good way for us to wrap all of that stuff up. So last class, we took some time to talk about performance studies. We spent last week talking about how social movements and social change communicate internally. The idea that what we see as the output or the product of a social movement, well, that came from all of the hard work and effort and communication and strategy that members of that movement did with each other to determine ultimately what we ended up seeing. So performance studies discusses the ways that we use social performance and engagement with other people as a strategy that connects to embodied forms of protest and activism. We've also examined the role of social enclaves, right? An enclave being a specific site or locality in which change takes place. And then the impact that these enclaves have on the ways that we communicate. So just to recap, right? The idea of an enclave, we think about a territory or community or group, right? An enclave is this little circle right here, and is a unique community that might be connected culturally or geographically or on the basis of identity or lived experience. So an example here of an enclave might be groups such as Wingspan and LGBTQ activism in Tucson, or other groups who have pushed such as EDH or the needs of migrant communities in these spaces as well. So in terms of the communication that happens, right, we talked about how an enclave or a small group interprets external messages that they see from other groups and uses those to invent and create strategies to respond to and address the rhetoric that they're hearing and the communication that they're hearing from other groups in order to pursue effective social change. Again, really good example of this is followed the midterms last week, right? The candidates and the major parties, right, would oftentimes interpret and make sense of polling data as it was coming in, say how they were feeling about that, report on how they're feeling, and use those enclaves as a sense of making meaning. So depending on where remaining counties were and what ballots needed to be given, still, that was a factor that these enclaves would do to make a decision. So this week is going to be kind of fun, right? This week, we're going to be talking about what tactics and strategies are used to constrain and limit social movements, right? We can talk until we're blue in the face about how this social movement was so cool. It did such cool activism, it had such cool methods and interesting approaches, right? And that's valuable. That's good for us to know. But when we're examining the effectiveness and the impact of a message, I think it's important to understand how that message is responded to, how people push back against that message, or attempt to control and constrain that message and its effectiveness, right? We see this discussed a lot in the context of civil rights, the context of Black Lives Matter and contemporary activism, the context of abortion, and a whole number of social movements in which, yes, there are advocates and people pushing for change, right? But there's a variety of approaches that are being used in order to undercut or hurt the ability of those movements to reach their audiences and work the way that they should be. I think it's important for us to be aware of these for a few different reasons. So we'll be looking for today at the Husting reading. This is a reading that's looking at media framing and how media strategies essentially position protesters as off-center or outside of what's considered to be the effective or democratic methods of communication. And then lastly, on Wednesday, we'll be looking at the Black piece that is discussing the Wonderland and Great K case. Actually, this one's about greyhound racing and kind of some animal rights related issues, but it's specifically looking at how legal strategies and other forms of control might be used to stifle communication and efforts to pursue change. One last note is I am waiting on a couple folks who have some extensions on the essays, and so I should have the essays turned in back to you by Wednesday. Apologies for not having those up yet, just waiting on a couple others. I think once I have those, I'll be good to unmute and post all of your scores. So we'll be looking at this in the context of abortion-related activism in 1991. Very timely topic for us to be looking at, both in general, but especially in the context of the Dobbs decision, and also in the context of how politics, including midterm politics in the past this past week, were very largely shaped by abortion and abortion-related discussion, right? In fact, up with inflation in the economy, abortion was ranked as one of the highest or most important topics for many voters last week. And the sort of impact and repercussions in a lot of state ballot initiatives and other practices, of course, have had a really big ripple effect and role here too. We'll also be talking a little bit about some of the theories and ideas that is shaping Husting's argument here, drawing from Hannah Arendt, and thinking about the activism that she's talking about and the strategies she's talking about as it relates to a lot of contemporary concerns and issues. So before we get into that, I did want to share for the Creative Movement presentation, I do have the rubric available for you on that assignment so that you have a sense of what we're looking for and what you can do to do well in this one, right? So the project that I gave you some time to think about and share last week is asking you to develop your own movement about a social or political issue that's important. A lot of you had some really good ideas here about how you might do something like a walkout or a protest in regards to lack of representation of women's sports or some type of climate-related initiative or some type of public education-related initiative on the topic of Indigenous rights and history. So what I'm going to be asking you to do in this presentation is take about 5 minutes to share with us what this movement is and how this movement would play out. Again, you don't have to actually go out and do it, although you're welcome to if you would like to outside of this class. But it's essentially showing us your design, what you've put together, and how this movement would work based on what we've been talking about in this class as to what you see as an effective movement. This presentation should be about 5 minutes. It should include visual aids. For example, you could use slides, use images, you could bring in some type of prop or example of what that movement is doing. And the presentations will either be on December 5th, if you're able to come to class on the 5th, or remote option if you're not able to come to class. And then on December 14th, very end of the term, I'll be asking you to complete a 2-page write-up where you're talking about the design of this movement and the ways that it connects to key ideas in communication and social change. So essentially, your assignment is divided up into both the presentation in class and the write-up at the end of the term, right? The presentation content I'm looking at 5 minutes. It's presenting the social movement in an engaging way. It's using visual aids to enhance the argument. I'm not looking for you to like be an incredibly polished and engaged public speaker, right? This is not a public speaking class, but I am expecting you to come in kind of prepared. You've rehearsed or practiced this before. You have a good sense of what you want to say. Right? What I really encourage you to do as you're gearing up for this is to practice really timing yourself, because it's really easy to be well below or well above the 5 minutes. The organization, are you clearly sharing this movement, what it is, what it does, and showing us this? Is it easy to follow, and are you using visual aids to enhance the overall argument? The write-up that you'll be turning in by the 16th or by the 14th of December, is it 2 pages? Is drawing from how you chose to organize and create the movement. For instance, you might talk about how this movement would involve social media and embodied rhetoric through intersectional rhetoric or a different framework that you might be using. And then are you organizing it with an introduction, body, and conclusion using APA, MLA, or Chicago citations, etc. So use this as you're working through and thinking about this presentation and write up. It'll be your last thing in the term. And then the other thing just to remember is that continue to work on the Canvas prompts. We have Canvas prompt number 6, our next one here. So the Canvas prompt will be this one. We'll have one the week after Thanksgiving, and then we'll have one the week after that. So this one is asking you to compare and look at these 2 different examples here of efforts to constrain and impact social movements. Yeah, Brett.
So with the video, does that mean like we would do like a Zoom, or can you use them recorded and then send it to you?
Sure. So I'm going to check in on that. I'm actually going to send out a Google form for Wednesday based on the times that people anticipate being available remotely, whether it's synchronous or not able to. Any other questions? All right. So I want to start here by sharing a video from Dr. Timothy Pacharak, who is professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts, and is well known and famous for his work in communication surrounding animal rights, including going into slaughterhouses, examining the practices and behavior in slaughterhouses, right? And more broadly, speaking about environmental and related activism. And I think that this clip does a really good job of framing some of the reasons that we should care about and think about the process of social change and social movement. So I'm going to share this and ask us to think a little bit here about some of the practices that are at play.
I think there's really 3 major questions that I focus on. The first question is about the relationship between knowledge, transparency, and social change. Often we make assumptions that social change is not occurring for lack of knowledge. And a lot of my research challenges that assumption by looking at situations where people have very clear knowledge of what's going on in terms of domination or exploitation or oppression, and yet continue to engage in those relationships. And so I think we need to do a lot more research into what happens when people actually know what's happening and yet don't change their attitudes. The second major area of questions that I'm looking at right now has to do with how we divide the line between allocating individual responsibility for societal harms and collective responsibility for societal harms. So I'm very interested in the allure of scapegoating and of punishment upon specific individuals or specific bounded locations of things that we're actually all collectively involved. And the third area of research that I'm interested in looking at the interconnected nature of the forms of oppression. So I don't think it's possible to talk about human relationships with non-human others without also talking about issues of anti-Black racism or misogyny? Ursula, what?
So Dr. Patrak actually brings up, I think, a couple of really interesting ideas more generally when he's talked about his strategies and his practices. In particular, he's famous for doing an undercover study of slaughterhouses, right? So he was invited, he participated in those spaces, but people who ran the slaughterhouses didn't know that he was doing this for research and for a project. And what he ultimately did, right, was discover and expose a lot of the practices that he felt were unethical, either to the animals or to the workers in those slaughterhouses. And his broader argument is pretty simple. Yes, we can communicate and understand the strategies of social change that are used to fulfill issues that we care about, right? So maybe we're especially engaged in LGBTQ rights, and we really want to examine how people are effectively advocating for LGBTQ rights. That can be useful. But what happens when we research and put out there what those strategies are, right? We lay bare what this communication is accomplishing and what strategies is being used to frame what we might positively see as social change. Well, we make that open and available for people in power, right, and members of oppressive groups to understand and refute those strategies. So his argument is that we need to do more to understand the communication that individuals in power use, or people who are oppressive or are disagreeing with the efforts or causes that we care about. Because if we study and understand the practices that are used to control or hurt our movement, we are also laying those bare, right? We are exposing and identifying the strategies and communication that is being used to harm our movement, and therefore we can better devise a response and way to address that. That oftentimes what we consider to be power or consider to be against or constraining our movement is not something we can fully comprehend, but if we better understand that, then we can better understand how to push back against that. In other words, speaking to and exposing power devises strategies that we can use to respond to power, right? So to use another example, if we are talking about immigrants and we are talking about immigrant rights, migrant rights, pushing on a topic such as DACA, it's important for us to understand how an opposing group is framing and talking about the issue. What strategies are they using? If we try to put out a movement, what are they going to be doing or saying to us that is trying to shut us down? And how can we preemptively address that or directly respond to a narrative or stereotype or frame? We might think back early on to the Occupy Homes Minnesota example, right? Where there was a dominant frame that suggested that people were to blame or responsible if they were foreclosed. And to speak to and expose power meant to identify that these large banks were exploiting people and people were doing their best. So the message was able to respond to that. A message's effectiveness and impact is oftentimes constrained by power and strategies of control. There's a famous piece by Dr. Kevin DeLuca that's talking about this idea of how protests against the World Trade Organization, right? In Seattle, World Trade Organization was pushing for free trade agreements that were generally creating open channels of trade. They were pushing back against that and saying that no, free open trade in all contexts is actually harmful to a lot of local and small businesses and communities. However, media played a really big role in framing that protest as violent, and in many ways diluted the message and the goals of the WTO protests and made it about something else, right? Framing a protest or form of activism as violence, whether or not it is oftentimes used as a strategy to constrain and limit the ways in which that movement is trying to achieve change. We might think back to the example a couple of weeks ago of the occupation of the bridge by Black Lives Matter protesters, right? And the example there of some protesters would knock over a trash can, but others down the line would try to put the trash can back up because they didn't want the press or perception of violence to become the dominant narrative to understand the movement. Lastly, we can think about the idea that strategies of control or power can be reclaimed or used in ways that might serve the interests or goals of the group. Again, we think about the ways in which language can be reclaimed and used in different ways. The term queer has a very pejorative meaning in the past, but has largely been reclaimed and used in a more positive sense. So this idea of using these strategies and tools in a different way to communicate for the sake of activism, I think is an important thing for us to consider too, right? Or we might think back to the example of Banksy, right? The anonymous street artist who uses imagery of kind of dominant cultural artifacts like Disneyland and uses that in a way to make a more subversive argument about the exploitation of large corporations. So this brings us to the Husting piece called Neutralizing Protest, Construction of War, Chaos, and National Identity from US television news on abortion-related protests in 1991. So this is approaching the ways in which media constrain the impact and effectiveness of social change communication. Again, we can think about media as a powerful filtering tool. While television is not something that everybody uses in the same way, in fact, television has a lot of generational differences in usage. A lot of younger generations are using streaming or they're using online services rather than something like cable subscription, right? TV, and especially TV ads and clips and the circulation of those clips is a really big element of how people are communicating and talking about issues online. So in looking at this one, I think it's important for us to set the stage and set forward some of the context, right? So 1981 saw a lot of differences, but also a lot of similarities in the ways in which abortion was being debated and discussed by a number of different groups. In particular, in a world where we think about Roe being codified and the impacts of Roe versus Wade, right? We see a lot of discussion and disagreement from groups such as August 1991, Operation Rescue in Wichita, Kansas, right? Operation Rescue was designed in order to protest and speak out against abortion. And its idea was that it was trying to do things like block abortion clinics in an effort to protect individuals, as they argued. But we also saw groups such as the National Organization for Women who were pushing back and pushing in favor of abortion rights in this area too. But we saw that a lot of these forms of protest, at the least in terms of media portrayal, were in many ways highlighting the violence that was happening in these cases. For example, the usage of things such as blockades, bombings of sites or clinics, and the use of protest at this movement were oftentimes framed in terms of how media was discussing and addressing this issue, right? Abortion protest becomes physical, or the usage of imagery here, right, of somebody being held down is really highly emphasized. And while there were certainly instances and examples of violence or disagreement that we can point to, right, in what ways might media representation distort how we come to understand or even think about the movement? Or, right, one concern that has come up a lot in recent years has been the both sides argument. That is, there are a variety of protesters who have different positions. You see this a lot in the discussion of like anti-fascist protests, right? There's a portrayal that both sides are being too violent or too extreme or too wrong, and both sides need to stop, when in actuality, the behaviors and practices of people are probably looking very different across each of those sides, right? They're not necessarily things that we can equate in terms of their values, their beliefs, or even the strategies that they use. So I wanted to share a clip that gets into and contextualizes some of the activism that was happening in this space at this time.
It was a Sunday morning like no other in Wichita or anywhere else. Pro-life rescues just don't happen on Sundays because abortion clinics aren't usually open on Sabbath mornings. But this one was, and it marks yet another turning point in Wichita's hot summer battle for life. This CBN News exclusive footage shows a clinic worker arriving just before 7 a.m. to open the doors. She is met by the sight of protesters blocking those doors and this man's camera. The confrontation you are seeing resulted in a woman pressing charges against the man for battery, which means she claims he made aggressive physical contact with her. Police confirmed to CBN News that the man was arrested and charged with battery. Not long after that confrontation, another act of aggression occurred at the clinic. This time, a policeman warned these adamantly determined demonstrators to close their eyes or move from the recessed doorway just seconds before spraying them with mace.
Get out of the way. Get out of the way. I'm not looking at you again. You got that to leave.
Police Deputy Chief Steve Trainer told CBN News Sunday that the police were defending themselves with a minimal show of force against, quote, protesters they felt were being aggressive. The same policeman then delivered these blows to demonstrators on the ground while trying to force them to unlink their arms. Our first camera shows you this angle. Our second camera caught this as yet unseen angle. CBN News does not yet know the identity of the police officer you just seen. Wichita City Manager Chris Churches did not return our call Sunday. Mayor Bob Knight told us that he called Churches and ordered an immediate full investigation into the policeman's conduct after watching our video on CNN. While Sunday's rescue came as a total surprise, so did the fact that the pro-choice rally Saturday morning only drew an estimated crowd of 5,000 or so. That in spite of big gun feminist speakers like Eleanor Smeal, Patricia Ireland, and Kate Michaelman, who called for the impeachment of pro-life Kansas Governor Joan Finney.
When the officials we elect side with terrorists, we must hold them accountable. Impeach Joan Finney.
Meanwhile, former National Organization for Women President Eleanor Smeal said that the battle over abortion isn't going as well as expected for pro-choicers.
In some ways, as a leader of the women's rights movement today, I feel as a failure. Because this should have been over a long time ago.
One other speaker of special interest at the pro-choice rally, Colleen Kelly Johnson, president of the Kansas NOW chapter and first cousin of the now famous federal judge of Wichita, Patrick Kelly. But in spite of Judge Kelly's threats to pro-lifers, the pro-life movement in Wichita continues to be anything but invisible. This pro-life group, called Rural America for Life, paraded 200 farm vehicles past Saturday's pro-choice rally just as it was disbanded. That sparked minor heated verbal confrontations between choicers and lifers, but none were violent. And in spite of Judge Kelly's hope that demonstrators in Wichita this weekend showed that the pro-life movement here looks bigger than ever. Police say this pro-life crowd Saturday night alone was well in excess of 8,000 to attend an outdoor concert of contemporary Christian musicians. But Sunday's pro-life rally surpassed them all with a turnout of 35,000 or more.
So I think one thing we can take away from this example is the significant variation and degree to which, in the context of Wichita and more broadly, the topic of abortion was being talked about, harassed, and portrayed in the context of different activists on different sides of that issue, right? So regardless of where you find yourself personally on this topic or how you feel about this topic, right? Rather than it being kind of ideological, I think it's about the ways in which what was going on at the time, right, and the forms of activism and protest that were happening from some of these groups at the time were being represented through media and portrayed through the use of sound bites, clips, snippets, and so on. We saw an example of this through the focus, right, on the kind of violent altercations, including those with police among members of the group, but also in terms of the disagreements and direct confrontation that was happening between these two. So here's where Husting comes down, right? In looking at this as a case study and in examining the communication that's happening here and the strategies that are being used here, right? So Husting's concern is the ways in which the language of war and use of things such as war metaphors are being used to portray and discuss the positions of either pro-choice, pro-life, anti-abortion, pro-abortion, etc. Perspectives might be communicated, right? The idea of a war trope of these pro and anti-abortion activists being against one another, right, on the one side, and on the other, the imagined community or the sensible people, right, who are outside of this conflict, is arguing that, in her words, it delegitimizes collective identity in favor of a national identity in opposition to protesters on all sides. In other words, she is concerned about the framing that if you take any position on this topic, or you protest or you engage to any way, that you are a part of the problem, that you are off center, regardless of your position on this topic, because you're not a reasonable person who wouldn't be engaged in this kind of war, right? And we can critique that from a number of angles. For a lot of people, right, the topic of abortion is an incredibly important, personal, and significant one to them. And the idea that being involved in a protest or demonstration means that you are extreme or outside of how you should be for your participation, well, that's a tactic. So Husting's analysis is about how, in her words, anti-democratic, interpretive, and discursive news strategies, the media knowledge that they produce about the quote-unquote abortion war impacts those communities, it impacts the communication more generally. Her argument is that framing the usage of activism or protest as outside of or against what should be the democratic or acceptable forms of engagement essentially moves both sides away from the issue. In other words, right, some of the language that was being used here, such as the topic, the beachhead and the heartlands, the front lines, the idea that Wichita was falling into disrepair, that language to frame the topic and to frame this issue is one that is essentially designed to discredit activism more generally on this topic. That a war over abortion as a media framework discredits activists regardless of their position on the topic, because if you are participating and if you are involved, regardless of your position, well, you're part of the war, you're part of the problem. So what I want you to do is to take some time on your own, and we've already started to do this in terms of our look at this video and some of the context that Husting brings here, is to look at some of the abortion protests, either in terms of pro-choice or pro-abortion, or pro-life, or anti-abortion, right, regardless of your terminology. What are you noticing? And this could be outside of Wichita as well. What is happening at this time? And then I want you to consider some of the more contemporary protests and activism and the way that this topic has been discussed. What's changed and what stayed the same? So take some time to look into this. If you don't have a device with you, you might find a partnership with somebody who does, just to take note of some of the things that you're noticing and are able to report on. So I'll give you about 10 minutes or so to look into this a little bit. When you have finished looking over or identifying some things here, both about the protests in 1991, but also some of the more contemporary forms, I would like you to find a partnership or group of three to compare and discuss some of the things that you've noticed and some of the findings that came up.
Sure. And like, now
Join that group or you're welcome to join and make that a group report if you'd like.
Would you like to do that? Or like it's one now, she's not.
Back then, it's Irish. Built with a lot of conflict interaction, everything. Usually, yeah, more peaceful, but more. I don't know. I pretty much.
People have the spaces. And so I think, as you said, it used to be, and now it's my own. What is? Sure. No, you're not allowed.
About 2, 3 more minutes, chat.
I think it's more, it's become more. Instead of like. I would say they're like fighting to make a change. Trying to bring it. Instead of COVID. Yeah. That was true.
Okay, so let's take some time to talk a little bit together about some of the things that you all noticed and stood out first in looking at these protests in 1991, as well as more of a contemporary context. So let's start with the group here up on this side. What were you noticing in 1991? What were some things that were standing out?
We kind of said that they performed sit-ins and used blockades at the entrance of clinics. And that like the goal was to blockade the entrance enough that like the clinics would have to shut down. And that was a very physical and impressive protest.
About next group back here, what were some things you noticed?
We basically talked about the same things that they mentioned.
Mhm.
This it would be more aggressive or more like, and they did a massive march on Washington.
In particular, one of the strategies that was present was the targeting of folks that in clinics that provided late-term abortion in particular. That was oftentimes very much in the crosshairs of a lot of anti-abortion activists, right? That was a pretty common strategy used in a lot of those sites there. So let's talk about the second question here in regards to contemporary protests or communication on that topic. Let's hear from this group of 4 over here. What were some things that you all noticed about what's changed or maybe stayed the same here?
We really talked about like direct.
Mhm.
To like have like more indirect opinions.
Mhm.
So everything we did was kind of like in the public eye and was very much like physical. Like they had to like physically be at the
Mhm.
spot that they were in the organization at. And I think like nowadays there's a lot more room to have more direct opportunities. And so like I know that there's like a lot of things on the internet, like groups that you can join and talk about like specific issues like abortion, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's also like created a lot more social change, I guess, within social media. And I think instead of having to like do protests against each other,
Mhm.
it's become more of like an awareness project where people are going out and mostly they're protesters to spread awareness other than to like show up and to like physically side and how
Mhm.
they have it.
Mhm.
And, I think it's just because of technology, it's a big thing.
Yeah. Especially in the context of like polarization and the ways that oftentimes perspectives on social and political topics tend to be more sedimented among publics. I think that a lot of times awareness campaigns and ones that are focused more on the educational elements have generally worked pretty well as a strategy to be aware on the issues and the ways that factual information that isn't otherwise available might be given. So I think, you know, good work here in helping to understand some of the ways that social media and online communication are facilitating some of those opportunities. How about the group back here in this corner?
We talked a lot kind of about social media as well, how there's a lot more support for shown through social media.
Mhm.
A lot of it's still very visible, but it's less effective.
Uh-huh.
I feel like, and kind of, that the protests do seem to be larger than they were in the past and a lot more spread out, like, in a lot more cities and not just in one area, like in Wichita.
Mhm.
And also kind of talking about how it's like spread to be kind of a more of a global issue and not just.
Yeah, absolutely. The ability for us to engage with social media, to engage online, and the ability to understand kind of some of the global ramifications and impacts of these policies on other people, I think are useful considerations for us to bring into. Right? The reason I had us do this together is to understand some of the history and context here, right? The practices that are being used in a lot of these movements at the time, and also to be thinking about some of the shifts and changes that we saw. Right? We still see embodied and physical activism, but the ways in which people are engaging online are definitely really different, but also the ways in which information is circulating online. For instance, an embodied protectional form of activism that is now being available and made available through social media, it's going viral and getting attention, is also speaking to the role that these shifts have had in our understanding. One thing that I think is useful to put into this context too is that in many ways, in the past, there's been an emphasis on the power of television, right? And the ability of television to, in many ways, frame and dictate the issue. But our ability to engage through using social media, other forms, and in many ways, our ability to pick our media sources and information in a lot more capacity means that we might have less of that top-down influence and more in terms of our own issue selection and identification. So let's take a break. We'll come back a little after 2, maybe like 2:03, 2:04, and we'll pick up on this. We'll talk a little bit more about Huffington piece and some of the arguments that are being made here.
So much fun. That was awesome.
So we're waiting on Laura, but let's go ahead and get back into things. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so I want to take some time to talk a little bit more about Husting's argument, some of the ideas he's drawing from here and making this argument. We'll do another individual and partner activity for the end. That'll be part 2 of your attendance. All right, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but earlier in the term, we've been talking about this idea of framing and agenda setting. you've taken a course related to media studies or media ethics, you're probably familiar with this idea. Media framing, again, is referring to how an issue is discussed. So saying peaceful, nonviolent activists march the Capitol versus saying violent insurrectionists storm the building, of course, are very different frames. So regardless of the truth value of what's happening, how an issue is being portrayed is important through something like a media headline. And also this idea of agenda setting. What are the topics of discussion? This idea that oftentimes the recurrence of a particular message or headline or topic or issue is shaping the way that we're thinking about and addressing the issue. That is, that our sense of reality is negotiated by how media represent and reflect or perhaps distort that reality, which creates a public perception of reality and what's going on, right? Again, discussion about protests and the violence or lack of violence at protests is an example here of framing and agenda setting at play. So this is useful as we're thinking about and understanding the argument that Husting is making here about media's role in this process. And I think a really good way for us to explore this topic in a little bit more detail is to explore some of the arguments that are made by and used here by Hannah Arendt. How many people have heard Arendt's name or had any sort of reading or discussion in the class about Arendt or Arendt's work? So pretty new to most folks, which is great. So Hannah Arendt was a Holocaust survivor and philosopher who was really concerned with the role of power in our human relationships and shared understanding. In fact, Hannah Arendt had a major book and argument that was talking about the idea of the banality of evil. And in particular, Arendt was focusing an analysis on Eichmann, right, who was a major figure in Nazi Germany, right? And in particular, she was following Eichmann's response in the Nuremberg trials that were, of course, identifying and condemning the horrors and atrocities of Nazi Germany and its impact. And what Arendt was struck by from this exchange was that Eichmann's language and the way that he justified his behavior and his, the horrible, deplorable things that he did was for him to say that he was just following orders, right? And in this way, Arendt was laying out this idea of the kind of banality of evil, that in many cases, right, people in positions of power who were doing horrible things make the rationalization or justification that they're just doing it because they're following orders. Not that that is a correct or right thing to do, but she found herself concerned with the lack of questioning or understanding or critical thinking that might otherwise prevent somebody in that position from doing those things, right? So when we think about this, it connects to some of her broader concerns surrounding society, governmental structure, and the role of dialogue, discussion, and disagreement in that context.
Hannah Arendt is very well known in continental philosophical circles, but remains fairly unfairly unknown outside of continental philosophy circles. Arendt is, of course, most famous for her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. That book was her report, trial of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, and that phrase that she develops there, the banality of evil, has somewhat become a part of human consciousness. Arendt's philosophical views that she expressed in that book, though, were formed much earlier. Arendt was a student and apparently lover of Martin Heidegger, and she also studied under philosopher Karl Jaspers. Arendt was a German Jew who originally opposed the Nazis until it became politically impossible for her to do so, and she escaped Germany just in time as she was about to undergo trial for illegal activities doing research on Nazi anti-Semitism, and just narrowly escaped the Nazi occupation France, which is one of the fortunate people to escape to the United States, that Nazi tyranny deeply affected her personally and philosophically. It inspired her to write in 1951 her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she took aim at what she called the novel form of government that is totalitarianism. Her argument in a nutshell is that totalitarianism, and by this we can understand fascism and Stalinism, differs from despotism, tyranny, or dictatorship in its use of terror to subjugate mass populations instead of subjugating only political adversaries. So whereas a dictator might kill off his political rivals and more or less leave the people alone, totalitarianism is a broader, all-encompassing terror of the population to keep them in mind. This led Arendt to conclude that the operative factor of Nazi terror was not the Jewish populations, because the Jews were merely a convenient excuse that they pulled from history, but the general Nazi practice of subjugation itself was the Nazi terror. Everyone was brought into line. Arendt's highly controversial claim is supported by the fact that the Nazi concentration camps were initially built not for Jewish people, but for leftist political activists and subversive intellectuals. Arendt in no way diminishes the anti-Semitism of the Nazis, and remember, she was a victim of it herself as a Jewish person. But Arendt places it into the wider historical context of the marginalization of minority populations throughout history, including colonialism. More broadly speaking,
Right. So there's a lot to unpack here surrounding her own role, perspective, and school political thought. It's definitely generated its critique, right? And we can push back and respond in whatever way we feel makes sense. But I do think it's useful to explain what this is bringing in the argument from Husting from this week's article, right? Because in using this kind of thought, the Husting piece is dealing with this idea, as Arendt brought up, that the public sphere involves putting together ideas to create a common world. That is, a plurality or open space of disagreeing perspectives. So this is a school of thought we've seen discussed a lot when we think about the public sphere, when we talk about when we go all the way back to the Griffin piece and some of the other ones, right? This idea of there being an openness to disagreement and expressing that disagreement in democratic society being seen as a good thing. In discussing totalitarianism, the impact of totalitarianism, one of the things that Brent is very concerned about is the controlling of ideas, right? And the idea that our beliefs or our ability to disagree on things is stifled through a kind of totalitarian regime. So this concern here is regarding individual and social. And Husting brings forward the idea that if identity is defined as a way that we are, as something that is fixed, rather than something that emerges as the result of our social relationships, our relationships to each other, our relationships to history, and our relationships to context, that we lose the possibility for political action or political change. That identity does not exist in a vacuum, identity exists in relationship, and the development of identity is something that happens over time. So if this is true, right, then Husting's concern is about how the usage of a national identity or the usage of nation building as something that is fixed and something that is static in the context of social change or communication on a number of issues, including abortion, raises issues. That is, if the framing by media of a topic assumes a static, fixed, neutral national identity from which activism diverges, well, that doesn't give us an opportunity to interrogate or investigate what that national identity is and what that national identity is trying to say. We take for granted that there is a neutral, reasonable population, and from that we have activists or people engaged in disagreement who are out on the fringes. Well, what does that say about the national identity that media has constructed that is supposedly existing within this reasonable space of acceptability? So that's part of the critique that Husting is bringing to the table, that if we are not able to interrogate or investigate how national identity might be created through media. We're not investigating how activism and change is playing out. So to take this a little bit further, right, and applying some of these ideas here. Media had positioned in 1991 through the use of television and other frames, the topic of abortion-related protests on a variety of different sides as a civil war, right? And the language of war between feminist groups and fundamentalists, including religious fundamentalists, whose violence poses a threat to decency and, quote, home territory. In this way, Husting argues that the news creates nation-building rhetoric through the construction of a national identity. Again, through the construction of a reasonable person who exists in the middle outside of the activism of protesters. And again, one consequence of this is that regardless of your identity, there's a good chance that you are either directly or indirectly impacted by these and other issues. In this way, a caricature of conflict is given when the primary victim is nation, community, or family, right? This is not to say that we can't critique or recognize or shouldn't draw attention to instances of violence in terms of protest and social change when they happen, right? We need to be attentive to that. We need to recognize that when it's coming up. However, the concern is when the representation of violence or conflict is distorted relative to what's happening. Right? Again, a desire, particularly in a lot of Black Lives Matter protests and activism, for media to portray it as violent is oftentimes used in a way that maybe distorts and doesn't properly represent what's happening. Again, we can think about the blocking of the bridge, the efforts to try to keep the garbage cans up rather than knock them over. Right? So this concern is that nation, community, and family are seen as what is normal, what is okay, what is good, then conflict and disagreement is seen as an obstacle toward achieving that. So the usage of war metaphors, I think, is a useful argument here to understand, I guess, unpack part of what Husting is trying to say. Okay? And war metaphors have been studied in a whole bunch of different contexts. In fact, here on the right is a movement that's discussing Quest for Life Foundation that is in the context of cancer, right? So life not in the context of abortion, and that terminology. We're talking about cancer and talking about the ways that we use communication to frame the issue of cancer, right? Oftentimes, when we think about diseases or conditions such as cancer, we think about this by using war metaphors, battling cancer, terminal cancer, suffering from cancer, losing a battle, versus, which is a very kind of Western frame of thinking about it, versus living with cancer, life-threatening cancer, being treated for, dying from cancer, and so on, right? This type of language and the usage of war and positioning cancer in an antagonistic way is present in a lot of health and health communication related circles. Again, the most expensive and closely watched Senate race was in Pennsylvania, and there was a lot of discussion because the Democratic candidate was a stroke survivor and about how he was using that language. And when he won that race, right, the media framing was to say that he overcame or beat or successfully battled a stroke, right? And that type of language or war framing, something we see in the media all the time. War talk and war metaphors are oftentimes used as a way to discredit the opposition, right? An us versus them mentality, someone is the enemy. It mobilizes people who follow and adhere to a set of beliefs, and they frame the conflict as a matter of justice, right? You're with us or against us, as George W. Bush said. Right? So as Husting brings up, a battlefield cannot also be a democracy. If the entire topic of abortion rights and abortion protests is framed as a civil war or as a war zone, it can't be democratic. It can't be a space for people to openly discuss or engage with issues. That is, protest is positioned as outside of the realm of democracy by media. And in this way, the concern is that by using more war metaphors to frame abortion activism in this way, it is putting it outside what is considered to be the acceptable engagement. And again, we've seen this discussed at length in the class about what we consider to be the boundaries of acceptable engagement. And if abortion protesters or activists are considered extreme or off center, then there's supposedly a normal center that is not being represented, right? And again, the war metaphors are being used either by individuals who are pro-choice, discussing the anti-abortion related attacks, including attacks on clinics, or right, the enemy is framed as people who are victims who are preborn, right, is the language that is being used by different sides on this topic. Another frame that I think is good to understand here is that Mary Douglas is briefly brought up, who's a British anthropologist, discussing how order is framed within societies and how outside of an established order, right, we portray things as abject, as dirty, as inappropriate or unengaged. And this type of language and what is existing outside of order in the context of these protests is something that's drawn from a little bit here too. So according to Husting, right, there's a few things that should be done. According to Husting, active and engaged coverage should better represent a range of perspectives on issues. In other words, right, media and journalism need to do better in terms of how they're reporting and expressing an issue. If violence has occurred at a site and it's not being represented, well, that needs to be covered. Or if a protest or form of activism is peaceful, it needs to be understood and portrayed as such. That coverage needs to better represent an issue that is happening and the needs and concerns of protesters. Because again, even as we saw in the 1991 case, the range of action and protest was much more diverse and different than two sides at war. And additionally, this idea that activism should not inherently be framed as oppositional to a constructed, reasonable, or democratic or civil public. We know from the history of civil rights, right, and a lot of different forms of activism that use of things such as civil disobedience and protest is a part of how change and activism happen. And so the idea that activism is oppositional or outside of reasonability in all contexts or is incoherent with democracy is a concern that Husting is bringing up here, right? So I think a broader takeaway from this one is that Husting is arguing that how media portray opposition and how media portray social movements plays a really big role in how we understand and make sense of those movements. We're not interested in engaging if we think two sides are at war with each other, but we are interested, or perhaps more interested, if we see their disagreement and understand the complexity of that disagreement, both in terms of what's acceptable or what we consider to be unacceptable as a form of activism, operating more broadly within the context of democratic participation. So what I want us to do now is take some time again on your own to think about an idea that you have for your Freedom Movement project. It could be what you talked a little bit about last week, or it just could be an idea that is starting to develop that you might be interested in exploring. And if you were to implement this project, what opposition or response would you expect to receive, right? Where would this come from? Who would be pushing back against what your advocacy is trying to do? How would they attempt to discredit? In other words, what strategies might they use specifically in response to you? And what might you use to respond to those efforts? So maybe you're advocating in favor of free school lunches, and you have a group that says that's too expensive and that's financially irresponsible. And you might say, well, you know, the cost of lunch is financially irresponsible and unsupportive to groups, right? So think about some of this and take some time to write or type some of your thoughts here about what type of opposition you might expect to receive from the movement you're interested in and how you might choose to address them. I'm gonna wrap this up. I would like you to again find a partnership or a group of three to whom you can share some of your ideas here about how you might respond to criticism or strategies that might try to control or constrain the movement. And as you're sharing and you come up with some additional ideas, feel free to jot those down as well.
Drive around. Now we always Yeah.
So take another minute or two to finish up your discussion here.
I don't know. Their reasoning.
Yeah.
And The one that I don't really know how that is, like, there's no data or that I can. Yeah, I don't touch my character. So my main strategy is this community has so you have to understand that I like this idea where character
Yeah.
factor that can be what I would I mean, there are like all draws.
It wouldn't be. Yeah, no, I don't.
Yeah, that's
Go ahead and finish up your discussion.
yeah, some lack or something. Of course, people that.
Yeah.
But other than those.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this together. So I was hovering around and hearing a few of your conversations. It sounds like you're coming up with some good and smart strategies. Part of this idea is that if you're thinking about what people who disagree with your movement or your goals might say, right, that can be baked in as a part of the movement or a part of your response. The way that you are perhaps preemptive or able to intuitively engage with opposing perspectives from the beginning, I think can help the strategy and communication that you use work even better. So continue to think about that and continue to develop what your communication strategies might look like for your presentation and the ways that you were thinking about opposing perspectives there, right? Because at the very least, understanding what values, beliefs, and ideas an opposing perspective comes from gives you a set of tools to work with it. So, right, again, from the Husking reading, the Husking reading is not saying that the use of violence and protest is acceptable. What it's saying is the ways in which media represent or discuss protest and use of activism can oftentimes be distorting or misrepresented. The use of things such as war metaphors and the Civil War framing does not necessarily get at the specificity of the communication at play, and it assumes that there is a group of people that are in the center from which activism is off-center, right? Equating two sets of people who might be very different in their tactics, their approaches, and their strategies can oftentimes be an incredibly damaging strategy, right? And understanding that the ways in which tactics of control or tactics meant to constrain movements are used is a useful, important component to understanding what makes social movements work, right? Because putting an idea out in the ether and then allowing other groups to take control of the messaging or framing of that movement is a big challenge. And in fact, a lot of successful movements and one of the strategies that movements have done, including the ones we looked at last week, right? LGBTQ and migrant activism have been doing strategies like correcting inaccurate media representations as well. So understanding how opposition groups might tend to control or constrain or implicate social movement is important toward developing effective strategies that can cut through oftentimes the mess and sheer amount of content that we find ourselves with every day. We'll be looking more at this on Wednesday, understanding some of the legal and other strategies that are used to constrain efforts of social change. So if you haven't done so already, please email or pass forward your attendance activity for today with your name on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy our increasingly wee hours of daylight before it gets dark. And I'll see you again on Wednesday's class.